First of all, let me welcome everybody. We still have people coming on, but I see lots of familiar names and faces, and delighted you all could to join us. Just a quick history here, and then I'm going to turn it right over to Anthony. RUBI came to my attention thanks to uh, help me, Kathleen, Lorraine King.
Lorraine
Uh,
King, yeah.
we were at a meeting and she said, "Do you know about RUBI?" And I said, "No." And she's told me about it. And I went to the website and liked what I saw and made contact with Anthony. And we've had conversations and their values and whatnot are very consistent with ours. And at this point, I'd say we have a sort of informal alliance to help one another and hope to build on that, starting with tonight's presentation. Anthony is, and Anthony, you can correct my description of you here, but Anthony is a unique sort of guy. He's both a policy wonk and a political guy, and a political operative, and a former candidate. He lives and is based in far southwestern Virginia, the rural, very rural part of Virginia, part of the state I know because we had a summer home not too far from there. And they're doing great things, research and reports and presentations and whatnot, uh, trying to find values and issues that cut across geographic and political lines. And that's obviously what Sierra Forward is all about too. So it's a natural sort of relationship. Anthony, I'll let you
Hey,
correct my
I'll need a straw.
bad description of you, and thank you for joining us. It's 9 o'clock in your time zone. I know that's a bit of an inconvenience,
Well
but
enough, I can try drinking it without.
we're delighted to have you. And if everybody could mute, we're getting some background conversation. Uh, Tom Merchant, can you mute your?
Sorry about that.
That's right. Thanks. So if everybody do that, that'd be helpful. Anthony, take it away.
Thanks, Les. Very glad to be with you. I've been looking forward to this. Les and I have been chatting for a while, as well as other members of Sierra Forward. And as Les put it well, I think I'm hoping this is, as they say in the movies, the beginning of a beautiful relationship. I really think that what you're doing is critical, and I think perhaps RUBI has some things that could be helpful to you, and vice versa. So tonight is kind of a teaser. It's got just a wee little bit of elements of the more full-blown training we do on the origins of the rural-urban divide and what to do about it. And it also then exposes you to a few other things RUBI does. So I'm glad to be here. Your description was perfectly fine, Les. The only thing you left out was that I'm also a farmer. I've been farming a small piece of land in Southwest Virginia that was a tobacco farm before my wife and I got it 30-ish years ago, and we've been raising organic produce since then. So the topic of the conversation, pretty straightforward, is really focused on why we, and by we, I mean Democrats, liberals, progressives, not always the same thing, but that spectrum. Why have we lost rural America? And we lost it badly, and what can we do about it? So this is the little teaser I'll go through quickly. And then RUBI's starting point is to recognize that when we're talking about what divides us, rural, urban, and other things, race is pretty fundamental. Race and racism. The piece that we want to bring into that conversation is not to minimize that, but to say very clearly that race and racism, as you would see from any of these books if you've read them, is baked into our country, our history, our founding, the economy of the first 2 centuries driven by slavery, And so really it's only in the last 60 or so years of our history that we've even begun to grapple with it. And so when we talk about the rural urban divide, or the divide between perhaps white working class people and others, we are very much confronting racism, but we've got to confront it in all of us and in all of the society. So it isn't just a rural problem. I love the way Heather McGee puts it. She says the plutocrats have always known that solidarity is the answer, that the sum of us can accomplish far more than just some of us. That's why the forces seeking to keep the economic rules exactly as they are aim to cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might develop for also struggling people of color. And so one of the questions that we're dealing with tonight and that RUBI tries to deal with is, why has this been so successful? Why, particularly over the last 15 years or so, we've been able to, as a society, cut off any sense of empathy white people who are struggling might have for also struggling people of color? Here's one thought about that, and a lot of what RUBI does kind of tries to grapple with that question. But one really interesting and I think insightful take on that question comes from one of RUBI's co-founders, Arlie Hochschild, who wrote the book Strangers in Their Own Land. This is not from a book, but from an essay she had published. And in the essay, she's talking about the allure of Trump, and specifically in this section about the big lie of the election being stolen. And Arlie says, why has the big lie stuck? Maybe it's because Donald Trump made it appear more plausible by attaching it to a truth. And that truth, for the blue-collar white men among his base, is a powerful sense of loss. From loss, Trump has moved the emotional needle to stolen. The right to work and remain maskless during a pandemic, stolen. Story of a heroic America, stolen. Statues, stolen. Culture, stolen. Old-time manhood, stolen. Election, stolen. With stolen as opposed to the more circumstantial loss, it's much easier to assign blame. So many of us on our side might very much feel like the story of heroic America needed significant revision, that the statues in question, Confederate statues, needed to come down, that old-time manhood needed to be redefined. But what Arlie is saying here is that from the perspective of those folks, much has been lost, and it's not been difficult for Trump and others to convince people that it's been taken from them. So the way RUBI frames it is that the first problem we have fundamentally with what Arlie's saying and many other factors that we cover in our training is that the fact is the Democratic brand stinks. And because the brand is so bad, we're getting creamed among rural voters. 2 in 3 hold an unfavorable view of the Democratic Party. Since 2018, Republicans have gained 7 points among voters earning less than $50,000. Now, that's a demographic that usually has been in the Democratic camp. In 2022, Republicans won 42% of union households, absolutely a core demographic of Democrats. But now Republicans are quite competitive. And as we'll see in a bit, we're also losing voters of color. So what's been the result of this very bad Democratic brand? Well, we've been hemorrhaging support. In my own state of Virginia, in 2021, we elected Glenn Youngkin, a Republican. 44 of Virginia's counties, all of them rural, voted 70% or more for Mr. Youngkin. Just 10 years earlier, the Republican at the top of the ticket had only 4 counties voting 70%. So we've had an 11-fold increase in the sort of overwhelmingly Republican counties in our state. And remember that it wasn't that long ago, 1992, when Bill Clinton won almost half of rural voters. Now Democrats are down to 30%. The last little bullet comes from my campaign. I ran in 2018, as Les said, and we ran a really, really great campaign. And I ran as a farmer and a working person, which is what I am. And interestingly, I can't tell you how many times, both during the campaign and after the campaign, everyday folks said to me, I would have voted for you if you weren't a Democrat. I'd love to send a farmer and a working person to Congress, but I can't vote for a Democrat. So part of it is a brand problem. Now, a study done of some of the really critical swing states in the old industrial belt in the Midwest looked at the changes in margins by kind of population centers. And on the left, you have 3 blue bars. And what these show in the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and the rest, how Democrats gained between 2012 and 2020. In big cities and metro areas, they gained 500,000 voters. In college and university towns, 140,000. In suburbs, again, a little more than 500,000. But those same gains were absolutely overwhelmed by how many people left the Democratic Party in those states, just those states, in that 8-year period. In mid-sized towns that had a strong manufacturing base that had been lost, in small towns that had depended on manufacturing, and in rural. Collectively, the people we lost were more than twice the people we gained. So often the Democratic Party and pundits and consultants have said, we just need to turn out our base. Forget about these other people. We can't get them. Well, turning out our base cannot compensate for the people we've lost among rural and working class. And one of the reasons for that is because liberals and Democrats too often have played right into the narrative, right into the narrative that we are elites, that working people and rural folks and farmers shouldn't trust us. Well, I don't buy that, but there's plenty of stuff that we've done that has shown that we have realigned ourselves with the professional class, much more so than the working class. And Larry Summers, who was critical to both the Clinton and Obama administrations, said it very plainly when he was challenged about it. What about all the workers, the white workers who were displaced by NAFTA and the other trade agreements? And he said simply, they weren't heavily on our radar screen. We're talking here millions of people. So this shift, you have a Republican Party that has been deeply aligned with big business, plutocrats, and investor-driven trade deals. When the Democrats began to join them on our economic policy, what happened? Well, an extreme concentration of wealth. So wealth hasn't trickled down over the last 40 years, as Ronald Reagan said it would. It's quite the opposite. It's been sucked up from workers to owners, from black to white households, from Main Street, family farms, small businesses to a handful of giant corporations, and from rural to urban places. And this concentration, this sucking up of wealth, is something we simply can't blame entirely on Republicans. There are obviously major differences between the two parties. But when it comes to economic and trade policy, the fact of the matter is that our party has too often joined the train that has concentrated wealth among the few. The elimination of the Glass-Steagall Act, with which Bill Clinton went along with the Republicans on, turned Wall Street loose to create trillions upon trillions of dollars of phony wealth, and then nearly sunk the economy. NAFTA and other trade deals, and even during President Obama's term, the fact that antitrust legislation, antitrust enforcement was so weak that virtually all mergers proceeded with little challenge from the government. Beyond the shift in the functional elements of the party, where we place our priorities and the kinds of policies, there's also been this shift in language. As our party has grown to be populated more and more by highly educated people, the reality is that too many of us look down upon people who don't have the same level of formal education and who make other choices. So prominent liberal and democratic spokespeople like Marcos from Daily Costs, saying we should be happy that the coal miners have lost their insurance because that's what they voted for. Or Paul Krugman referring to Trump voters as chumps and losers who destroyed their own lives. And then more commonly, what I hear from just lots of rank and file liberals and Dems is the statement, I don't understand, why do these people keep voting against their own interests? Well, maybe when they see these kinds of things, calling them idiots, it's part of why they don't vote our way. One other bit of information on this is a relatively recent, very large focus group study done by Democracy Corps, in which people from across the spectrum were asked about how they envision the future. And what they found is that Democrats envision the future generally, this is 2021, shortly after the election, to be quite exciting, a progressive future that was interesting and new things and just really they were looking forward to it. But white working class people and small town people didn't see it that way at all. They saw the future as an elitist society in which they have no place. Now, the second problem we face that RUBI tries to confront is just the absence of the Democratic Party and liberal and progressive groups. Now, this is not true 100%, obviously. Many of us progressives living in rural are trying to do our best. But overall, the Democratic Party and the supportive kinds of liberal and progressive groups have minimal presence in rural areas. There's been, for 30 years at least, very little, if any, investment in local party infrastructure or candidates. There's been a lack of attention at state and especially federal level to rural development, investment, policy, action. And so local Democrats often feel very isolated and despairing. They feel like the party doesn't even know they exist or doesn't pay attention to them. That's local Democrats in rural areas. The rural residents who are not Democrats feel it even more keenly, disdain. They see Dems as absent from their area or even fighting against their interests. And we're not just talking here about rural white people or working class white people, because in fact, for the last 3 or 4 election cycles, we've been losing voters of color. 18%, that's a huge number that we've lost in the last 3 cycles. 41% of Latinos voted for Trump in 2020. After 4 years of it, 41% voted. And a really shocking thing, a very recent poll, a couple months old, done by New York Times and Siena, shows that Biden's lead over Trump among working class people of color is just 16 points. Now, this is people's stated preference for who they think they'll vote for. It's not votes themselves. But Biden beat Trump among working class people of color by 48 points in 2020. Now, according to this poll, it was just a 16-point lead. That's a shocking difference. And one more thing to remember is that 70% of voters of color are working class, just like 70% of people are. So when we on the left kind of think about the working class, and if we think in our minds that it's just old white people that don't get it and they're stuck in a prior century, we're also talking about the vast majority of people of color in this country. So very often, rhetorically, liberals and progressives have prioritized people of color, but indeed, much less so, particularly bread and butter economic issues. We tend to take for granted Black and Latino, as well as Asian and Native American voters, but we can't because we're losing. And we're not just losing them because they're disappointed about specific policy failures. A whole lot of them don't see themselves as liberal. They don't buy the whole liberal or progressive package of what we think that means to be a moderate. Goodness. Only 1 in 4 voters of color identify themselves as liberal. 3/4 see themselves as either moderate or conservative. So a little bit about RUBI, and then I'll wrap up. RUBI is intending to turn this around, and who we are is a network of people from across the country that came together about 2.5 years ago to tackle the rural-urban divide. We have a mix of folks, people who are deeply into politics, like Jane Klebb, the chair of the Nebraska Democratic Party, or Chloe Maxman, who was a 2-term state senator in rural Maine, who now runs her own nonprofit. We have people leading the charge on rural organizing and rural outreach, people like Matt Morrison, who runs Working America, or Cynthia Wallace, who does very similar work focused on Black and voters of color in rural North Carolina. And then we have folks like Arlie Hochschild and others who bring a kind of analytical, intellectual heft to what we do. That's who RUBI is. And we talk about our strategy for overcoming the divide in 3 ways. We say that if Democrats, liberals, and progressives want to overcome this downward spiral where we've been losing working class and rural people, we have to think differently, talk differently, and act differently. So what do we offer to do that? Well, first of all, we do periodic reports, as Les said earlier. So these reports are based on a lot of research. And last year, we released in November a report called Can Democrats Succeed in Rural America? It's up on our website. It's a fairly large report that includes research that other people have done that we summarized and condensed and organized about why Democrats have lost rural and what we can do to get it back. And it also includes original research we did, 50 interviews with Democrats who ran in rural districts, state or federal office, and who did much better than they were supposed to. They either won or they beat the partisan lean substantially. So that's an example of the kind of research and analysis and reports RUBI does. We've done others since then. We do monthly briefings. This is an image of Chloe Maxman, one of our partners, and Chloe's been one of more than 24 people who presented at RUBI's monthly briefings, which are the first Wednesday of every month at 4:00 Eastern. Really great, short and sweet, a lot of discussion from thinkers and doers from across the country on this. And more recently, in early January, we added a podcast, which I lead, and I interview very interesting people tackling the divide. We call it 2 Worlds, 1 Country. So that's a little bit of what RUBI does. Probably our signature thing, and something Les and I have discussed that I hope Sierra Forward might consider sponsoring at some point, is our Rural Urban Divide training. And the Rural Urban Divide training is a 2-hour training. It can be done 1 hour 1 week and 1 hour the next. It can be done virtually or in person. We've done it more than 50 times, and it really gets deeply to the underlying causes of the rural-urban divide. Here's what we consider them to be. I won't go through them now, but just to give you a quick summary. We've done trainings in all of the places that you see. And we've done them with local Dems. We've done them with nonpartisan groups like the Union of Concerned Scientists or Sierra Club or the Just Transition Fund. And we've done them for Democratic-leaning nonpartisan groups like Indivisible and Our Revolution. We adapt it to whoever we're working with. That's thinking differently. Acting differently includes 2 levels in RUBI's way of tackling this. One is around policy. We've got to work on consistently getting policy that serves rural America much better than the policies of the last 40 years. Now, there's a lot of specifics. There's areas where we agree with more conservative rural people who are cultural traditionalists and conservative on social issues. There's a lot of agreement on economic issues. But of all the issues where there's agreement, RUBI thinks the one we should be prioritizing, or one of the ones, is taking on corporations, antitrust, while simultaneously supporting and investing in small business. Both of those are extraordinarily popular in rural areas, and they would make an enormous difference. Just a month ago in September, we released the Rural New Deal. Progressive Democrats of America came to us. They asked us to do a training, which we did, and then they asked us to help write the Rural New Deal, which we did. And we published it about 6 weeks ago. And it's a really good document. It's on our website. It's essentially a large policy platform with 10 pillars. The great thing about the Rural New Deal is that each pillar, has a half a dozen or so very specific recommendations for things the federal government can do, all of which are based in experience, like time-tested rural development, everything from housing, healthcare issues, through to economic development and agriculture. It's not pie in the sky. It's grounded in things that we know work because people have been doing it. The other thing about policy is we have an opportunity, and it's a tough nut to crack because the Americans generally, and rural people particularly, just think the economy's a mess. But the fact of the matter is that while every president since Clinton has talked about bringing back manufacturing, it's the Biden administration that has invested. You look at this curve right here and how it shoots up almost linearly. It shoots up because that represents this tremendous level of investment with the Inflation Reduction, the CHIPS Act, and the bill that came right after COVID that we are doing in manufacturing. What's been the result of that? What's been the result of focusing on manufacturing, on reshoring jobs, and on small business? Well, 10 million new small business applications were filed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, a record far beyond anything previously. Small businesses created over 3 million new jobs, 800,000 of which were manufacturing jobs. And the other very critical side wasn't just support for small businesses or new green manufacturing. The Biden administration has prioritized antitrust, fighting back against corporations like no president of the last 40 years. Certainly not any Republican, but no Democrat either. They have truly prioritized, continue to this day, fighting everything from the Albertsons-Kroger merger to going after a firm called AgriStats that has been manipulating prices for poultry and meats that has led to much higher prices for consumer and lower prices for farmers. And the other thing that the Biden administration has done that we need to be talking about is these two relatively obscure but critical steps that the National Labor Relations Board just issued 3 months ago that require companies to hold elections promptly when a majority of workers show an interest in a union. Right now, or up to now, companies have been able to delay and whittle away at the workers, but they can't do that anymore. And on top of that, during that period between workers filing an intent to vote on a union and the vote itself, if the company does anything that is considered an unfair labor practice, certainly firing union organizers or intimidation or anything like that, the National Labor Relations Board will recognize the union automatically. These are monumental changes that most folks don't know about, that it's going to level the playing field between organized labor and management. The last element of acting differently that I'll talk about is community engagement. Now, this is a really exciting thing that we have been talking about and encouraging for a couple of years, but have just launched in a formal sense in Virginia, and we're soon going to launch in North Carolina. And we hope to make it national in a couple of years. Community Works is a very simple idea. Democrats have got a bad brand problem. They need to rehabilitate it. But we can't rehabilitate the brand just with better language and better policy. We have to rebuild trust starting at the local level. That's the way we're going to broaden our base. And so Community Works focuses on getting local Democratic committees who oftentimes only seem to show up in small towns and rural communities when we're pissed off. A social justice group, an environmental group, a local Dem group will show up at a protest, a march, a rally, dump Trump, fight racial violence, end gun violence, all good and necessary stuff. But for rural people, this just tends to confirm their view that we don't understand them. We have different priorities and preoccupations, that we're not interested in their concerns. Community Works is going to test the idea that what would happen if Democrats and liberals start showing up en masse, not just individuals, but en masse, doing regular old concrete work in the community, from picking up trash along the stream banks to fixing a house for the elderly to working with the food pantry to get food to parts of the community that have not been reached. We are testing this proposition. We have rural counties in Virginia and North Carolina. We're going to actually be doing surveys before and after 2 years of Community Works. We think this could really help to restart the conversation. So I'll wrap it up there by just saying that rural progressivism is not an oxymoron. It's just that we have to understand how to formulate progressive ideas, policies, and language that work and that fit in a rural community. So that's all I've got. That's the introduction, and we've got about 30 minutes or more if you want for comments and questions.
I'm sure we'll have questions. I know I've got a couple, perhaps others, but I'll let others indicate whether they'd like to ask a question. And I'll try to recognize you on the screen. Anybody want to start? Well, let me answer one issue that you didn't, well, a broad question, and that is you didn't focus on how we need to talk differently. I'd like to get into that a little bit more because I think that's an issue. But on the question of race, I want to broaden it, and that is one of the things we've seen in El Dorado County and elsewhere in rural California, well, elsewhere in California, and this antedates the war in the Middle East, but it has been an alarming increase in anti-Semitism and some indications of Islamophobia and whatnot. And my question here is there any research that suggests that those, I know those issues exist everywhere, right? I get that. But is it worse in rural America than in urban or suburban America? So two questions. How do we talk differently? And this question of not just racial resentment, but other kinds of prejudice.
Yeah, I don't know how I did it when I was struggling to get the right presentation. I think that's what was missing was the talk different piece. So I will talk about that a little bit. Thanks, Les. In terms of the racial resentment, resentment around religious minorities, Judaism, even you could probably carry it over to homophobia. I'll say two things about it. First of all, again, as I said at the beginning, it's really a national problem. But I won't say that it isn't more of a problem in rural. I don't know what the research says about that. I would say from my own experience, the disadvantage that a lot of rural people have, especially people who were born and raised, is generally speaking, this varies. There's some very, very racially diverse rural counties, but generally rural counties have much less racial diversity. And so when you're not living side by side with people and not experiencing them as neighbors and fellow human beings, it's a little bit easier, I think, to be swayed and fall victim to whether it's scapegoating or whether it's just seeing them as fundamentally different. So I think there is some of that. And I think as rural counties do diversify, and that's certainly happening with immigration at several levels, we'll be better prepared to deal with it. We have our monthly briefing in November, which is next Wednesday, November 1st at 4 o'clock Eastern. We have a gentleman presenting who is focused on the role of race in voting for Trump. And he did extensive look, a deep dive into, was race really a major factor in voting patterns? And we're really excited about this. We don't know exactly what his findings are going to say, but those who are interested in the impact on voting or how it sways people to vote really ought to attend. And by the way, if you just go to the RUBI website and sign up, you'll get notices for our briefings. So there's that. I would say battling racism and anti-Semitism is something that's been part of our history from the beginning, and it's obviously still a terrible struggle. But I will say that in my experience, when people feel they can trust you, when they feel you have their back, those kinds of things become much less prominent in their perspective. I'm not saying they become completely free of all prejudice, but it doesn't agitate and motivate the way it does now. My example is a story I've told a number of times. I actually ran for Congress twice, and the first time was in 2012. And I was going to an event in a tiny little town in rural Russell County, Virginia. And it was April of 2012, and a retired miner who'd been to several of my campaign events greeted me as I pulled in. And the first thing he said to me was, "What do you think about that bombshell Obama's dropped on us?" And I didn't know what he meant at first. I thought maybe it was an environmental regulation. So I just looked at him, and he said, gay marriage. And then it hit me. Oh, yeah. President Obama came out in favor of same-sex marriage the prior week. So I just looked at him and I said, "Well, what do you think?" And he started in immediately. The first thing he said was, "Well, the Bible says it's an abomination." And then he went from there. He was talking about it's not right. Marriage was meant for a man and a woman. He couldn't, blah, blah, blah. He was quite agitated about it. So I let him have his say. Now, keep in mind, we're walking from my car to the place where I'm about to talk to a group of folks, do my stump speech. And after he was done talking, I just looked at him and I said, "Well, I know how it can be kind of odd. For some folks, it just seems odd. But the thing for me is that the main message I get from the Bible is that we're supposed to love one another, especially people we don't want to love, especially people that are different from us and we find hard to love." And that was all I said. And he pondered and he said, "Well, I guess you're right." And then the next thing he said was, "Well, I suppose they're just born that way anyway." So the point of the story is this fella moved from homosexuality being an abomination before God and something that agitated him to, "You're right, we should just love those folks. And anyway, that's just who they are." And he moved that journey in about 2 minutes because he knew that I was the guy that had been on the picket lines with him and his fellow miners during the Pittston strike. He knew I was a person who'd worked on economic development in the coal counties. He knew I had gone to bat for better black lung legislation. In other words, he understood me to be somebody on his side, and being on his side opened up the possibility of understanding and movement. So that's a long story, but I really think that's what progressives have to do. When we scold people for what we consider to be backward views, that absolutely doesn't help. When we build trust by actually taking on people's concerns, we begin to build that trust. And that's the fundamental first lesson of the talk different communication. We got to talk less, listen more, and then we've got to make sure that we're really respecting other people's views. We're not just listening to give them a chance to talk so we can then say what we think. We're listening to find out if they have something to teach us. We're listening to find out if they have some insights that we didn't have. We're listening to find out why they believe what they believe. And that's really, there's a lot more to it. RUBI has a whole communication training, but that's the essence of it. Much less talking, much more interest in the other side, and also speaking plainly, speaking in very few words. Very few words. I'm going to shut up in a minute because there's 3 hands raised. But one other example I've given on the language issue is October of 2016, a month before Trump was elected. The two candidates, Trump and Hillary Clinton, were asked about the proposed merger of AT&T and Time Warner. And Hillary Clinton's campaign took 4 days before they issued a statement. And the statement they issued was 135 words long. And it was like this. It was meandering. It said, this is a critical issue that we will carefully study and analyze. We will bring every stakeholder to the table. We will consider all. It was 4 days, 135 words, and you still didn't know where she stood. That's too frequently where we come from as liberals and progressives. Trump, the next day, said, I won't allow it. It concentrates too much power in the hands of a few. Now, Trump's a liar, but that's the kind of language that we so rarely use.
Yeah. Yeah. Let's go to questions. I'm going to just go across the screen as I said. Muriel Moore.
Sorry, I'm unmuting. Yes, and this is to the group and to Anthony. Bingo, you're right on target, Anthony. I'm Placer County, Roseville, okay? And we have California all over has a lot of issues, but I want to go first. I was going to jump into something else, but when you started on the LBGQ XYZ issue in Placer County, I know that all the cohorts of the movement that's going on, that's attacking within our schools and the different kinds of stance they want to take within our schools regarding LBGQ and the kids and so forth. I know in Roseville, in June, there was a town hall, there was a city council meeting whereby they stormed, of course, the opponents stormed both Rockland and Roseville city council meeting. I thought when I came to the city council meeting that it was because the budget was on the agenda. I thought it was that, whoa, we're going to be talking, look, all these people going to talk about the budget. Well, no, they were slamming they came to slam, this big protest group, the idea that the reason they came to slam the great gay pride month because the mayor and one of the council people had attended one of the gay pride events that was held at Royer Park. So there were about, maybe 50 or so people that got up for public comment and lambasting the mayor and this, that, and the other and so forth. And I went, whoa, because I'm never at a loss for words, but I knew you have to pick your time. That's what I agree with Anthony. You have to pick your time for talking out about an incident, and I wanted it to be the right words that came across. So the next council meeting, and there were very few people there, of course, everybody had gotten up. I had a prepared statement in regards to that incident at the city council meeting. But one of the things that I wanted to say in regards to that was that the Bible, which is what Anthony had started to say, and that gentleman that had approached him, that's exactly what I used in terms of that to get things quelled down, because you don't know where people are going to come from. And if you can diffuse the situation and turn it around in terms of what their thought process is and let them start thinking about what that issue is rather than you engaging in a free for all in terms of the wording. I hope I'm coming across okay on that. So that's letting it go. And my final comment on the council meeting that I was at, the final comment was that because we dubs ourselves as we are Roseville, we are very diverse and so forth, which we are. We're a very diverse community. in terms of ethnicities and groups of people and so forth. And my statement was that if those people that are so disheartened by the people that and their lifestyle that is approved in this country, if they are so disheartened by that, then they too can find a Greyhound bus that's going to take them back to Texas or to Florida so that we can continue to have a good Roseville and Rockland and Placer County as we should. That's on one thing, but I want to say what I have found is that in our county, our Democratic or Democratic leaning organizations, we compete too much against ourselves. We need to be all on the same page. We don't need to be going after everybody's in the same club. Everybody's, in 3 or 4 Democratic clubs. Well, come on, we need to be coming together. The days, I feel, of always knocking on doors is not going to get it. That was our generation, my generation. There's a different day and age in terms of how we meet those people that we want to embrace and bring into the Democratic Party and into our ideology, okay, other than knocking on doors and picking up a phone. People don't answer their phones these days. We have to come up with a better tool and using those things that certainly the GOP, that the Republicans use to reach out, and a bigger platform, something that draws them in, and it becomes about issues, not about a party. It should be about issues. That's what draws people out. And with that, I yield back to, I yield my time. Okay, back. I am done. Thank you.
Thank you, Muriel.
You're welcome.
Pat Kriz, good to see you, Pat.
Hi, Les. Am I on? You can hear me?
Yes,
Yep.
there you're fine.
Okay. I wanted to address a question to Anthony, and I have joined Braver Angels earlier this year. I am working on my attitude adjustment. I am trying to be open-minded, but I have a problem with my attitude towards some rural entities because I was on a school board 40 years ago, and I've been in this county a long time, over 50 years. I found out on the school board that oftentimes the people in the rural areas had an entitlement attitude, that because they lived in the school district, they may have lived at the end of a long, narrow dirt road, but they still expected services like school buses.
Well, now wait a second.
Okay, I'm telling you, I'm working on my attitude adjustment. They expected things that everyone in the more urban, suburban areas also had and expected. They wanted snowplow. They wanted county maintained roads. They wanted water from EID. They wanted utilities. They wanted everything that was available and offered in the more suburban areas. I know some of them were longtime residents, but there were also many new people in the more rural areas who had moved in from suburban areas and wanted to upgrade immediately. Well, now it's a condition that people want broadband, they want traffic control, they want everything in the rural areas that they have in the suburban areas. But time and again, they voted down library taxes, they voted down fire district improvements, they voted down ambulance service taxes, they voted down road improvements, they voted down school bond issues, and they voted down so many things that they say they want, but they're not willing to pay for. And some of that I realize is economic. But I still think it's a condition of feeling entitled to all the things they would have had they lived in a more suburban area, but they chose not to because they wanted the acreage and perhaps the conditions of being more isolated in a more scenic area. And I think it's a dilemma that we all face when we have an urban, suburban, rural interface in our communities. And I don't know if you've dealt with this in a more
Oh, Pat, you're muted.
it was hard to say no to these people, but like offering broadband, there was simply no financial means to provide broadband to some of these people who were trying to get on Wi-Fi and get on the internet. And how do you deal with those people when you can't quite come to a common ground agreement?
Pat, sorry, I want to get Anthony to react to the comments you made and others. But before I do that, Steve Hurley, you were reacting to what Pat was saying, and now you're waving your hand. So I want to call on you.
Yeah, Pat, they're just plain angry, man. They are angry. Look, I go up to McKnight at 6:30 in the morning when the tradespeople are gassing up. I look at the bumper stickers on their car. I get their names. I look them up in the voter database. They're all Republicans. They're all Republicans. Invariably, the small tradespeople, little entrepreneurs, they're Republicans at this point because we have lost the working class. Another incident, I was getting my roof redone. The last thing this very nice guy says to me, he goes, "Sether Roofing, last of the great white roofers." Okay, so it's like what perception's reality. You can call them any name you want. You do not understand how mad these people are. I'm up in Truckee, okay, and there's a lot of wealth in Truckee. These cars are stopping by, picking up undocumented workers in the morning, piling them into the Mercedes, and they're going off to a day's work. Okay, now tradespeople see this, the Caucasians that are competing directly with these undocumented people, and they're going, why do you want to put Trump in jail? You can't get these people arrested for employing undocumented workers. Now, it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong, or this is how they feel, and people vote how they feel. So we're really missing the boat here. Fortunately, the Biden administration gets it, and they're going bottom up, middle out. Bottom up, middle out. That's what we want to do with the economy. We want to lift the bottom back into the middle and then expand the middle class. Can we do it in time? That's the question. There is a White House initiative called Rural Strong. I know that they get the issue, but I'm so on board with the idea that we have to wade into this, the middle of these lower middle class, bedraggled, they feel themselves victim. We got to wade right into the middle of it and talk in very short sentences that we want them back. And it has to be emotional. We can't do this intellectually.
Anthony, I'm going to turn to you to react to the comments. And
so there's a lot in both what Pat and Steve said. And I would say again, not to do too much shameless self-promotion, but a lot of the kind of really complex and difficult issues you're raising are much better grappled with in our full-blown rural-urban divide training, because we really get to the heart of why so many people are so pissed off. And one of the things that we make clear, I think, with a tremendous amount of evidence and corroboration, is that while the anger, the outrage is stoked and exaggerated by Trump and DeSantis and Hannity and all of that's true, it isn't nevertheless grounded in reality. So in other words, first thing we need to do is recognize that a lot of these people that are pissed off for damn good reasons. Okay, that's number one. Second thing is that what Pat described with people expecting basic services, you referred to it as an entitlement mentality, Pat. I wouldn't characterize it that way. I would say that even people in the hollers of Appalachia and some other places have enough connection to the outer world to know that this is what most people have, and they rightly feel like they ought to as well. So that to me is not, I don't think we'd say of people in suburbia or the city wanting good broadband and a workable water and sewer system that they had an entitlement mentality. So I don't see that. I do see what you're saying about people want the services, but not always, but frequently vote against the kinds of either tax hikes or fees or other things that would fund them. That's a real problem. But again, like the fact that the anger is grounded in a lot of like a 40 or 50 year history of mostly betrayal, that what you're describing, Pat, has a strong element that people simply don't trust the government, and they think the government wastes a tremendous amount of money. So people can look at the lack of the basic infrastructure in their own rural area, their own small town, say they want it, they deserve it, but not want to raise taxes. And what's going on in a lot of their minds is we shouldn't have to raise our taxes. The government already taxes us so much. The millionaires and the billionaires don't pay their fair share. And here we are, they're asking us to pay more into the system when we don't get what we should get out of the system. So there's a sense that if the government was not corrupt, not in the hands of the rich, and was more efficient, they wouldn't have to pay additional to get these basic services. So again, we can debate the details of that. That's not entirely true, but that's part of what's going on in that thinking. So I think it would be helpful in your and our collective attitude adjustment, as you put it, Pat, to try to move away from the feeling that that's an entitlement mentality, more to the sense that that's what most of us expect the government to provide. So if it's an entitlement mentality for rural people, I'd say it is for everybody.
Kathleen.
Hi, I want to say that I appreciate the talk very much tonight. I'm wondering though, Anthony, if you can help us move forward a little bit, that what I hear from Democrats is a lot of talk, there's so many problems, but not enough engagement. How do we move people to the engagement to even get them interested, for example, in attending your RUBI training, to even get them to begin to think about the talking and acting and, you know, thinking differently, and then move them towards the other piece that you're talking about in terms of community works, more this en masse, larger sort of volunteer effort. I don't see, even looking tonight, we have 33 people on this Zoom. How do we reach out to more? What's sort of a better marketing technique, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, that is always the $64,000 question, Kathleen. It's all of us are prone to gripe about things and then not take the kinds of actions that are available to us. That's kind of human nature. But there's a couple things we could do. If after this call and the leadership of Sierra Forward decides you want to move forward, the first step I would recommend would be a rural-urban divide training, the full training, and we can figure out the details of the when and how to structure it. I think to get a better crowd, and I'd say a better crowd would be maybe closer to 75 to 100, besides promotion, and when this was very well promoted through the mailing list of Sierra Forward, I would identify a handful of local Democratic committees and a handful of local liberal or progressive organizations within your fairly large service area. Talk with them. What we frequently do with RUBI is we hold a preliminary kind of exploratory call with what we consider to be the potential hosts. So we might do a training and we might have 5 or 6 different hosts. In your case, it could be Sierra Forward. It could be a local environmental group. It could be a local group that's working on land use issues, ag issues, and it could be, 3 or 4 Democratic committees. We get on a Zoom call. We talk through what the training is about, what people get out of it, and what the next steps it offers for people are. And then once you have multiple hosts, each of whom can go to their own lists, you're more likely to get a better turnout. And not only a better turnout at the training, but then each host group can go back after the training to their members or their network and begin to implement some of what was learned or some of what was discussed. So that's kind of the way that we both build the audience for the engagement in the training, and the way we kind of invest it in local groups so that they can then carry it forward. If it's just sort of like 80 miscellaneous people that aren't otherwise connected, it's more likely to just sort of stay at the head level and not go anywhere. If it's vested in a handful of host organizations, you've got much better chance of doing something with it. That would be my guidance.
Marion Washburn. Yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to discuss and hear Anthony's thoughts on something that I have noticed over time, a long time, is that a lot of voters seem to be persuaded by the most brief kinds of phrases. And to sound a little prejudiced myself, I've noticed that the Republican Party has used that technique of singling out kind of accusatory type phrases that, and we saw it in sex-related issues, especially with children, and the phrases "Democrats hate America" and "radical liberals" and sort of thing. It strikes me that Republicans have a knack for boiling an emotion down to a single phrase, and it really is a very effective thing that people who hear those phrases over and over again find themselves persuaded. And I think Democrats, your illustration of Hillary and her multi-page report was perfect, because I think a lot of the Democrats like to be A+ students. We want a perfect grade on our reports and cover all the bases. Meanwhile, we put a lot of people to sleep and they don't find themselves emotionally compelled, quite like those phrases from the opposite side. So it strikes me as it's kind of the elitist tendency that Democrats might have, that we don't want. But on the other hand, Republicans really have a persuasive how best to deal out without losing our integrity and communicating what we're about, but in a less ponderous way.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with you completely.
So I'm hoping Anthony has some thoughts on that one. It's a puzzlement to me.
Sure. No, I mean, Republicans and conservatives more broadly have been way better at communication than Democrats and liberals for a long time. Reagan, a lot of us on this call probably didn't like the way Reagan talked, but he was pretty much a master communicator because he was very good at simplifying complex issues. Now, a lot of us on the progressive side would say, well, they're oversimplifying. It's way more complicated than that. And it often is. But so there's a few things. Yeah, there's a few things I would say. One is it's always better for people generally, but especially for rural and working people, to get to the heart of the matter quickly. We don't tend to do that. That doesn't necessarily mean we have to oversimplify. It simply means we have to find the heart of the matter. The second thing that we tend not to do that successful liberal and Democrats who win elections do is we find local examples to talk about complicated big issues. When I was running, and before and after that, as a matter of fact, when I talked about the unfair advantages that corporations had compared to small businesses, I would cite very real and very recent example in our community of a big corporation, in this case, Cabela's, getting a $50 million taxpayer subsidy to locate a retail shop near one of our towns, and Lowe's getting another 12 million to close one store and open a new one in the same location. And I would talk about that to people. I would say, you know about Cabela's and Lowe's. Did you know they got together, they got over $60 million of our money, taxpayer money? Do you know that over here, Mahoney's, that sells the same kinds of things that Cabela's does, and Barry's, that sells the same sort of thing as Lowe's, do you know how much they got? They got nothing. They got nothing. So if we can talk from both fewer words, but also from local concrete examples, it helps to open the door. The people we're talking to are neither stupid, nor, I would even challenge a little bit, any more driven by emotions than we are. They are driven by emotions, but so are we. So are we. So I would say that what we have to recognize is that it's how we talk and also what we talk about. So often we simply aren't talking about the things that are top of mind for them, that are the main thing that they're concerned about. And so it's both how we talk, but what we choose to talk about. I think that's it. And we could learn a lot from Republicans. We could learn how to dramatically shrink and simplify what we do talk about by listening to them.
You know, Anthony, your story about Hillary and Trump on that issue with AT&T and whatnot, I was not involved in that, but I've been involved in probably 200 such things, and I can tell you what happened. Why it took 4 days, because they probably had a dozen or 15 meetings with every conceivable interest group and pundit and whatnot, checking off all the boxes. And so it took 4 days to come up with mush rather than just give, a 20-word answer. I mean, we get constipated when it comes to communications around issues like that. Rosalie.
Well, I mean, I've always said that Democrats have a terrible, we don't message well. I mean, Republicans come up with words that really get people crazy. I had just talked to a woman, a Republican in this area, who talks about after birth abortions. And I said, there's no such thing. But now I read it that Mike Johnson said that, and other people are saying that. Trump says, we're doing that. And I'm thinking, how do they come up with things that aren't real and make people believe? And I'm not saying that Democrats should do that, but it makes me crazy. And I learned a long time ago that if Democrats don't coalesce, someone told me that Republicans are told what to do when they do it, and Democrats, it's like herding cats. So how do we figure that we're going to win anything if we're not together? And I really wish that they would come up with something simple, like when Biden said, build back better. Well, that was such a tongue twister for me. Democrats deliver sounds so much better. Short and sweet, but how do you get these guys in Washington to come up with messaging that really talks to people, especially young people too, because we need more young people in our, look at us all online here. We're all over a certain age. So, we're dying out, and hopefully our party is still going to be going. So anyway, that's me.
I think you're right on a lot of that, Rosalie. One thing is, when I talk briefly, and again, all of this is way more fleshed out in the training, but when I spoke about how the Democratic Party had shifted from being the party of primarily the working class to being the professional class, and Thomas Frank has written about that for about 3 books worth now. In FDR's days, now of course there was much higher percentage of the population then did not have college degrees, But the reality is that FDR had a lot of people in his administration, senior positions, who didn't have college degrees. They were working folks. And the shift over time that Democrats have made is not only to people who can't communicate plainly, talk plainly, but it's really to people who come from an enormous amount of formal education. And the burden of that is partly a communication burden, because then in those settings, it's like less. Everything has to be so carefully weighed and all the parameters and possibilities and blah, blah, blah. That's one of the problems. The other is when you've grown up and you've been surrounded by, for your whole professional life, people of a similar level of education, you simply don't know what to even ask, what questions to ask farmers or working people. When I hear people say that we have people who are educated and people who are uneducated, now having been in a rural area for almost 5 decades, the first thing that comes to my mind always is I know very few of those highly educated people who would know the first thing about how to handle a chainsaw and cut up a tree and stack wood, or what kind of wood is best for burning. They wouldn't know the first thing about how to deal with early blight in my tomato patch. They wouldn't know the first thing about fixing a tractor. But we have decided that one type of education is education.
Yeah.
And the other is not education, it's skills. It's a very much a lesser thing, even though farmers and even coal miners and loggers have a tremendous bank of knowledge. They don't just have bodies that can do the work, they have knowledge. It's knowledge that's embedded in that. And so part of our challenge is recognizing that formally educated people are not the only educated people. And if we can bring more working class and rural people in to key positions in our organizations, in our institutions, and in government, then we're going to have a much better chance of having the policies and the language that would follow. Yeah,
you know, Anthony, in addition to the level of education and whatnot, I think, again, based on my own experience and observation, there's another element to this, and that is democratic administrations and congressional staffs and whatnot are heavily weighted towards the Ivy League and elitist universities.
Yep.
There are very few people who come from state schools.
Right.
And there's a mindset that goes with that, and a way of talking that goes with that. That's a real problem. We're at an hour and 15 minutes, and I promised Anthony we'd keep this short because it's late in southwestern Virginia. So I think what we'll do is wrap this up, and I'll tell you a couple things. One, we recorded this. We'll edit it, not just to make it smooth and whatnot, and we'll post it on the website so that everybody will be able to go back and take a look and listen to the key points and whatnot. What I would like, if folks on the call wouldn't mind, is send me an email, Les at Sierra Forward, or Mary at Sierra Forward, or Kathleen at Sierra Forward, or Corley at Sierra Forward, doesn't matter who it goes to, and give us a reaction, not just to the presentation, I don't want that, but on the interest in a training program, because I think that would be very helpful, Anthony, if we could do that and move to that step. And I want to get some people to agree to help, because I like your idea of establishing a cadre of organizers or hosts or whatever we call them to expect. We had, and this has been typical of all of our town halls. We get about half the people who register end up attending. Now, I know life interferes, right? But I'm happy with the number, but it could have been higher. And if we do the training, I want to make sure we have a good turnout. So I thank everybody for your attendance and your interest and your questions. It's good to see old friends on here and some new names. And Anthony, thank you very much. It's fascinating and a lot to chew on. I did just one last anecdote. In the Clinton administration, I was asked to be part of a group to lobby on behalf of NAFTA, which I did, and as a volunteer, I might add, I mean unpaid. And subsequently, and I've talked to people who were involved with that. My friend Bo Cutter being one of them, because he was one of the leads on that. We pushed for NAFTA without thinking about the consequences to the manufacturing sector. In other words, had we given more thought to that and tried to devise policies to offset the effects of NAFTA, it could have made an enormous difference, not just politically, but substantively. And Larry Summers, sort of admits to that. But it was a classic mistake, just a classic oversight. Regardless where you come down on NAFTA, we could have done a much better job of cushioning the blow. No question about it. So, all right, everybody, thank you again. And we'll have another town hall meeting. We're trying to set one up in early November. We're having a little scheduling problem, but we'll keep everybody posted. And thank you again for participating. Thanks, Anthony. It's great having you.
Yeah, it was great being here. Thanks a lot, and hope we get to work together.
Yeah, likewise. Take care. Bye-bye.